Hello, welcome to Canadian Aviation. I'm a Canadian flight instructor. With this channel, I'm going to be sharing my experiences as an aviator. In this video, I'm going to talk about the chapters in the FTM, that is the Flight Training Manual, the order you'll learn them in when you're in the sky, when you begin your flying journey. And if you're new to flying or want to know what it's like to be a pilot, this is a good set of lessons to go over to feel like what it's like to fly. This is the core elements of being a pilot. Okay, so in this plane, you'll notice it's broken into two parts. There's part one and part two. Part one is things we have to know before we fly. I won't go over that in this series. Part two is almost all stuff we need to know before we even move the aircraft, except for taxiing. That's all things you need to know before you start the series. This series is going to be focused on chapters 5 through chapter 24, with the note that you also need to be studying chapters 29 and 30. So you should start studying those two chapters all the way up when we start part 2, and those chapters are emergency procedures and radio communications. Those will be skills you will develop along the way, and it takes a long time to memorize all your emergency procedures, so make sure you're on top of that. The chapters I'll go over are attitudes and movements, and attitudes and movements are getting used to the different attitudes that an aircraft can have. We'll talk about that. Another one is straight and level flight. What is straight and level flight and how to maintain it, how to notice it and recognize it. Climbing, that is the procedure for entering into a climb and recovering from a climb. Descending, procedure for entering into a descent, recovering from a descent. Turning, for entering into a turn and recovering from a turn, but turning actually gets a little more complicated in that in this lesson in the book, it'll talk about steep turns. We aren't going to do any steep turns for a while as there's some safety issues that need to be managed. So we'll focus on normal turns and talk about steep turns later. We'll talk about flight for range and endurance. That is learning how to fly for the furthest distance on the fuel that we have or for the longest amount of time for the fuel that we have. Slow flight. When we slow down too much, we aren't paying attention, we can wind up in a range called slow flight. This is a dangerous condition. You need to know how to recognize that and recover from it. So that's what we'll talk about. Stalls, if we wind up going even slower than slow flight range, we might stall the aircraft. If that happens, you should never let that happen, but should you let it happen, you need to know how to recognize it and recover from it immediately. Spins. Boy, if you've had a really, really bad day and you've gone through slow flight and you stalled the aircraft, you may spin. Spin is a very dangerous flight condition. You need to know how to recognize it and recover from it, and we'll talk about that. Then there's spirals. So a spiral is something that typically happens when you have lost reference to outside. Maybe you've flown into a cloud. You're in a bad day, and you should, as a VFR pilot, which is what you are when you're reading this book, a VFR pilot is a visual flight rules pilot. Your requirement is always fly when you can see clearly outside. If you can't see clearly, you may wind up in a spiral dive. That is, you bank the aircraft. That's what causes a spiral dive. If you bank the aircraft and your nose is down, your airspeed's increasing, you're entering a spiral dive, and that can very quickly wind up with a collision on the ground. The reason it happens generally is because the pilot can't see outside and doesn't notice it's happening. Okay, so in chapter 14, we will talk about how to identify a spiral dive and how to recover from a spiral dive. And now that we've talked about spiral dives, we can go back to turns. Because a steep turn can lead to a spiral dive. So if we're going to practice steep turns, we need to know how to recognize and recover from a spiral dive first. So that's why the order. So spiral dive, steep turns, and then we'll come back to slipping. Slips can be very useful. We'll talk about how to make them useful for runway alignment and for descending, and how to avoid a skid. Okay. At this point, you've come to kind of a momentous occasion in a pilot's career. We're going to talk about takeoff, circuit, and approach. Those kind of all go hand in hand because every time you take off, you can't take off if you don't land. Okay, so we'll basically be practicing takeoffs, circuit, and approach, likely all together. And you really need to master these three, and of course all the previous lessons, to be able to move on. Students sometimes get stuck in this series, okay? So it's definitely important, and we'll take a especially closer look on these set of steps, because once you're done, the takeoff, the circuit, and the approach, you will get to fly all by yourself for the first time in your first solo. All right, now the circuit is the process of the aircraft taking off, flying in a circuit, coming all the way around, and landing. All right, and then doing it over again, taking off and doing it over and over and over again. That is the circuit. All right, once you've completed your first solo, we'll talk about illusions created by drift, how to notice them, how to compensate for them, precautionary landings. So when we're flying our aircraft, we may wind up in a situation where we want to land somewhere different than we planned, or we need to land a little earlier than expected in an airfield different than the one we planned. That's a precautionary landing. It may also include landing in a field, so there's a bunch of steps that we would follow to execute a precautionary landing. And there's a forced landing. A forced landing is something that happens when we have a serious issue happen, like our engine fails, all right, and we're forced to land right now. This is a process you need to have memorized completely because it happens quite quickly. They are fun, but they are a little stressful, and you need to be able to identify a field and land in it basically in about 2-3 minutes time. After that, we'll talk about pilot navigation. There's kind of two different parts to navigation. Navigation, the normal navigation, you plan on the ground, you go up in the air, and you have to follow your route successfully, okay? And if you wind up off course, you have to know how to correct your course and get back on track. That's normal navigation. While you're navigating, you may want to navigate to an alternate location, so we'll also practice that, how to change your plan while flying the plane. How do you use the map to fly to a different location? All of that is pilot navigation and definitely on your flight test. When we're done all of that, we will talk about instrument flying. Now, I'll point it again. When we're reading this book and learning how to fly and becoming a PPL license or a private pilot license holder, we are practicing what's known as visual flight rules, or VFR. Okay. As VFR pilots, we cannot ever fly if it's cloudy outside or there's some sort of thing in our way or obstructing our vision of the ground. Okay. We cannot ever fly like that. But if you wind up in the air and you have a bad day and clouds form and you just either failed to plan or they came out of nowhere, you need to know how to fly with instruments. So your first time learning instruments, this is really just an emergency procedure. Okay, you should never be flying this deliberately, not until you've got a proper IFR rating, or Instrument Flight Rules rating. So in your VFR phase, we will do some instrument flying. You will learn how to manage that should you accidentally fly into the clouds, in the hopes that you can prevent having an accident should it happen to you. There are some other chapters here we'll skip over because you won't be doing them until after your PPL. But you definitely, as I said earlier, want to do your emergency procedures, your radio comms, and you probably want to take a look over type conversions depending on the airplane you fly. You may want to learn some of the extra features that different airplanes, single-engine airplanes, can have. So that's it. I hope you enjoy my series. As always, please give me a thumbs up if you like what I've said or if I've given you any help. Subscribe to the channel would be the greatest honor. And if I've said anything that you appreciated or you think needs correcting, be sure to leave a comment down below. They are all welcome, and I appreciate your participation. As always, good luck with your flight journey, and here's the skies.